to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Welcome, everybody.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for showing up to the seminar series. My name is Nick Kurtz. I'm a master's student in the GES department. Dr. Brian Harvey is a Jack Corkery and George Corkery Endowed Professor in Forest Science, is an assistant professor in the School of Environmental and Forest at the University of Washington. His research focuses on understanding the nature of forest disturbances, such as fires and insect outbreaks, and how forest structure and function is shaped by disturbances, interactions among disturbances, and climate. His work spans field studies to large spatial data sets and analyses, drawing on insights from landscape ecology and community ecology. His research focuses on disturbance ecology of forests in coastal California, the U.S. Rocky Mountains, and Pacific Northwest. And without further ado, Dr. Brian Harvey.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Nick. And let me make sure I can get the screen sharing working here, and I'll double check to confirm that folks can see it. Let's see, hang on. Screen 2, share. Yes. All right. Is that working?
Yes.
Looks good.
Okay, great. Let me know if at any point anything goes off the rails and I can adjust. And if you can't hear me, see the screen, whatever, we'll roll with it and make sure I don't go too far down the road without knowing that. So feel free to interrupt. Yeah, Nick, thanks so much for the introduction. And Andy, thanks so much for the invitation. This is an honor to be able to present to this group. And for me, it's really fun to think about this and talk about this with a geography department or a geography focused department, because although I am in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington, and a lot of my work is kind of squarely in the ecology and management realm, my background and training is partially in geography. I did my undergrad and master's in geography before doing my PhD in ecology. So I've always got a soft spot in my heart for geography and thinking about these systems from multiple different dimensions and angles. So it's really fun to be able to share some of this with you all and get some feedback and insights from you all. So as Nick said, my name is Brian Harvey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at University of Washington. And I'm going to share with you all today some work that I was in the intro part kind of talking about. It's not even quite hot off the press yet. It's sort of like in the middle of the on its way towards press. It's basically taking you into a little bit of a tour of the work that we're doing locally here on this topic of forest fires in Western Cascadia, and looking at several different dimensions of that. And so I'll explain a little bit of where that region is and what that means and why it's different. But first, start off with some general fire ecology background just to kind of set the scene here. So before I get started, I do want to acknowledge a lot of collaborators, graduate students, funders, and supporters and partners who are a part of this work. When I was putting together this slide, it really is a pretty humbling feeling when I realized I've been here at UW just over 4 years, and this has really kind of grown as a really impressive collaboration of people and folks supporting this work in many different dimensions. So I want to give lots of credit here, as well as many of these folks will be highlighted on particular slides and dimensions of this research. Okay, so this topic of fire and fire in North America, fire in Western North America, fire anywhere on the planet is one that I usually say needs little introduction. And the reason why is because, as many of you probably know, we get in some ways kind of assaulted by the news on fire almost on a daily basis. It seems like there's a record-breaking event or some new benchmark that's been reached in the world of forest fire ecology or fire ecology. and it's front page news. Almost, I used to say, every few years it's front page news, and then it was like, no, it's an annual event that it's front page news, and now it's kind of like a weekly event because all around the globe there are interesting and important things happening in terms of fire changing around the planet. So this is just 2 screenshots from the 2020 fire season, which was a really big one on the West Coast, where you can see on the left-hand shot a satellite image of multiple fires all burning at the same time. If you were to look at that and say those fires all burned in one fire season, that would be a pretty big whopper of a fire season. But those were actually burning all at the same time, right? That's not a composite satellite image. That's a single satellite image of fires all burning at the same time up and down the West Coast. And then this shot on the right, it's probably good for me to qualify this because a lot of folks who saw a shot like this in the news that summer thought that this was the Golden Gate Bridge and this was like San Francisco on fire because it kind of looks like the Golden Gate Bridge. But this is actually a bridge over Lake Oroville in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains that just kind of really highlights that how close these fires were to infrastructure, humans, and the catastrophic effects that they had societally as well. Although, again, that's not San Francisco. That would be a different situation if that was San Francisco. So fire is a big topic these days. And it's also really, really, really important to kind of on that backdrop, take a zoom out and remember, or at least elevate the reminder that fire has been a part of landscapes in North America for a very long time. And fire has been a part of terrestrial landscapes across the planet as long as plants have been on land. And so while it is a big topic in the news, and it is often for very understandable reasons a scary topic in the news, it's an absolutely integral part of how ecosystems have worked on this planet prior to humans, as well as the very long record of humans interacting with fire, and particularly in places like the Western North American landscapes, where we can look and clues all around us about the fire adaptive traits in the plant fossil record. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at a serotinous cone of a tree that is basically really well adapted to a high severity fire that is needed to pop that cone open and release all those seeds, right? And so that's just one of many, many, many fire adaptive plant traits that are out there and give us clues as to the role that fire has played through evolutionary history. And then fire has been used as a management tool by humans as long as they've been interacting with landscapes. And that's no different in Western North America. For approximately the last 10,000 years, indigenous communities have been using fire throughout that history and still today as a very important tool to manage the landscape and manage vegetation. And so I bring that up because these are, there's interesting natural dimensions with fire on these landscapes, but also cultural dimensions of fire on these landscapes for a very long time. So that's all good as a background, but we also know that the planet is warming and fire activity is increasing, right? Those two things are really tightly connected, and both individually as well as their combination of climate change and fire activity, both of those things are front page news, again, almost on a weekly or daily basis at different times now. And so this is just a satellite shot of what was a few years ago the largest fire in California's recorded history. In 2018, this is the Mendocino complex. That fire broke the previous record that was set just about 8 months prior to that. And the fire prior to that was a fire that burned in November through December in Southern California and had set the previous large fire record in California. And this record has since been eclipsed by not one, but 2 fires in terms of total area burned. So record-breaking fire years are an annual event in many places because of this increase in fire activity. And we know that there's a very strong relationship between that and climate warming. This is some work that came out last year after the big 2020 fire year that just kind of gave an update of many other studies that have shown this relationship between area burned on the left axis and the red bars, and then summer vapor pressure deficit or an index of drought in the black line and on the right axis. And those things are really tightly correlated with one another, right? An R square of 0.56, basically they're tracking each other through time. And that's because one way to think about this is if we boil this down to the ingredients of fire, we need fuels to burn, we need something to ignite those fuels, and you can get a really big fire when there's winds kicking, but hot, dry conditions are really what condition those fuels to be able to burn and allow a fire to spread, given that there is some ignition on the landscape and winds kicking that up. And so many fire ecologists often think about this as, you know, the conditions that are needed for a fire to happen. You need fire ignitions, hot, dry conditions, and winds. And as the climate is continuing to warm, those hot, dry conditions are basically becoming more and more abundant. And in one sense, it's kind of loading the dice for all of those things to come up as, you know, snake eyes or whatever you want to say as you're rolling the dice. The probability of all those things aligning increases as you're just basically increasing the amount of each of those ingredients. And there's plenty of fuels on landscapes. There has been for a long time. There will be for the foreseeable future. Plenty of ignitions from both lightning and human-caused ignitions on many landscapes. And winds are probably a little bit of a wild card in terms of how climate change might affect wind patterns. But even if we assume that wind patterns are going to stay the same with climate warming, if all those things are there in abundant supply, that hot, dry conditions on the increase is basically, again, just loading the dice for these things to come up. And in some ways, it's not really a surprise that we would be seeing this kind of fire activity that we've been seeing across the planet. Paleo record shows that warm, dry periods in the past have lots of fire activity. The physical and biological and chemical ingredients are there for fire activity. And so, again, not much of a surprise that we would be seeing increasing fire activity with warming across the planet. The fire season itself, it was interesting that Andy asked this question earlier about the fire season and what does that actually look like? And in fact, the answer to that is it's changing. The fire season is lengthening globally. And this is a paper led by Matt Jolly a couple of years ago, who's a researcher with the Forest Service in Missoula, Montana. They basically looked at the conditions that are conducive to fires and defined a fire season basically being the time between the start of those conditions and the end of those conditions during typically the summer months in any part of the planet, and found that while that's variable across the planet, on average, over the last few decades, the fire season has expanded by about 2 weeks, or in other words, is starting a week earlier and ending a week later than where it was, at least in the early 1980s. And so, again, the environmental envelope or the environmental window of conditions that are conducive to fire are expanding. And that fire season is even changing right before our eyes. And you can see on this map that there are some hotspots across the globe in terms of where that change is most rapid or profound. And Western North America is one of those, right there. It's not the only one by any stretch. We also know from some work that was led by John Abotsoglu and Park Williams, who took this really interesting approach, I'll explain in a second. We also know that the anthropogenic signal of that increase in fire activity via climate change is fairly strong and detectable. And basically what they did in this paper is took the attribution approach that is used in a lot of climate warming attribution, right? To say, like, if you modeled climate dynamics without human-caused or anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, what would the climate warming be with that or without that? And then you can look at the difference to see what that signature is of the human imprint on climate warming. They took that same approach, but basically carried it through the logical steps to what that climate warming means for increasing fire activity. And the bottom line from their work was that about half of the increase in additional fire activity, about half of this increase that we've seen over the last few decades can be attributed to the human-caused climate warming that we're responsible for, the anthropogenic climate change. And so fire's on the rise. Human caused climate change is part of what's driving that. It's not the only thing, and that's not going away anytime soon. The past few slides I showed you led to a recent study that is really hot off the press. This just came out a week ago in Nature Communications, and it's a paper that we worked on, and John Abatsoglu was the lead author on this, and he's done a lot of the fire climate work over the years. And basically what we looked at is, at some point, there's this idea that fires are gonna burn and burn and burn, and we're just gonna run out of fuel. And then that's gonna impose a self-limiting feedback on this runaway fire train. And at some point, we can imagine that has to happen, right? If you have really hot, dry areas, you have a fire and it's, desert-like conditions following that fire, you're not gonna have vegetation that's going to be able to grow back and continue to feed future fires. But how far are we from that? How far are we from that, self-imposed feedback? That's kind of an extreme example, but even we know that, a fire that happened last year, it removes fuel, it makes a fire next year in that same spot less likely to occur. So what we did in this study is we imposed different levels of fuel limitation, and don't want you to worry about the details there, but just recognize that we sort of took an approach where we applied a range of different strengths of that negative feedback of fire removing fuel and making future fire less possible. And even in the most aggressive negative feedbacks that we imposed, we still saw a very strong prediction of an increase in fire activity over the next few decades relative to what we've seen today, right? So we're in 2021 today. Even with these fuel feedbacks, there's very little suggestion that we're going to see a big dampening of the increase in fire activity. In other words, fire seasons like what we've seen in 2018, 2020, 2021, the big ones of, even the last few years, are not expected to be anomalous. They're expected to be more associated with the norm of what may unfold over the next few decades here. So I set that up not to be, doom and gloom about fire and forest, but to at least just kind of like the big picture context globally, what's going on with forests and fire. And then I also want to bring up that I think when most of us think about fire-prone forests, we're probably immediately, at least in North America, thinking about frequent fire forests. And what I mean by that is the classic one in the western half of the US that gets a lot of attention, understandably, because of its relationship with fire, is the ponderosa pine forest or ponderosa pine woodland, right? And here we're looking at two pictures of fire-scarred ponderosa pine, which is a really, really, really brilliant demonstration of this adaptation of these trees to be able to survive frequent low severity fires. And they've got bark that's almost a foot thick on some of the large trees, really good insulator against fire when it comes through, and especially so when fire comes through frequently. And because it comes through frequently and is kind of keeping that fuel load low, it's very, very, very likely to be a low intensity fire that these trees can survive. And so that's probably, I would imagine, where most of us think about fire prone forests and the relationship that fire plays in these forests. And we often hear now about how those forests, because they've been missing fire for so long, there's this big fire deficit because of exclusion of indigenous and cultural burning, as well as fire suppression over the last 100 years in many locations. A lot of these areas, because they've been missing that fire, now have fuel loads that are 2 to 3 times the historical level. And if a fire were to come through there now, even though you've got some of those fire resistant ponderosa pines, like you see in the middle there, you also have, again, 2 to 3 times the fuel load or biomass around them, to where a fire is going to come through and it's going to be much more severe now than it was historically. And so I bring that up because I feel like that's a really good and familiar example likely to a lot of us in when we think about fire-prone ecosystems, is these frequent fire adapted to be able to survive by these big thick bark trees. They might scar, but they can live through fires. And there's similar dynamics in a lot of Eastern North American forests, right? Oak forests that experience frequent fire, have thick bark, can survive those fires. It's a very common starting point for a lot of us to think about fire activity, though it's only one part of the story when we think about fires. And what I mean by that is if we look at a map of Washington, and this dotted line here in the middle is the Cascade Crest. I love to show this map, although it itself is becoming outdated because so much has changed since 2017 when I originally made this map. But I'll intentionally show this right now because in a place like Washington, we often, basically the Cascade Crest is the dividing line between our wet coastal forests on the west side and the dry interior forests on the east side. And this map shows us the level of fire activity across either side of the Cascades in the last several decades. So 1984, some of you in a geography department, I'm sure, know there's nothing magical about that date, other than that's when the Landsat thematic mapper satellite went up and provides us a really awesome record of satellite measured fires. And so a lot of the fire atlases we have started in 1984 in terms of certain things that we want to measure with satellites. And from 1984 to 2017, most of the fire activity was on the east side of the Cascades. And it's easy to get the sense that on the wet west side of the Cascades, fire doesn't really play a role in these ecosystems. In fact, if you were to sum up the total burned area that occurred in these 3 decades, 99.9% of it is on the east side of the Cascades, and less than 0.1% is on the west side of the Cascades. However, that sense of security about fire potentially not being a thing on the west side of the Cascades is really due to the fact that the fire regime is entirely different on the west side of the Cascades. And the regime, I just mean the characteristics that fire typically plays historically in space and time in those patterns, right? So how frequently does it come? How big is it? How severe is it when it comes? Does it kill a lot of the trees or not? And on the west side of the Cascades, the fire rotation, or the time required to burn the entire landscape, is one way to think about that. The other way to think about this is at a given patch of forest, the average interval between fires coming through is on the order of centuries, and sometimes even approaching a millennia. So it's a very different relationship with fire, but still a fire-prone and fire-shaped forest for sure. So I bring this up because I'm going to pivot now in this talk and let you all in on the world of what fire means in the Western Cascades, because it's a really interesting and almost as challenging, or challenging in different ways, of a fire context that we have here relative to those frequent fire forests that happen in drier ecosystems. And so I'm going to talk about this region, Western Cascadia here, which is essentially, as you saw on the earlier map, west of the Cascade Crest in northern Oregon and western Washington, essentially in an area that is characterized by a Mediterranean climate to a degree, not in the way we think about it in Mediterranean regions around the world, like California or the Mediterranean region of Europe or South America, Australia. But we do have a winter wet and summer dry climate here. But we have a really wet winter and a moderately dry summer. And so what that means is we've got conditions that are conducive to some of the highest biomass forests in the world in this region, and that the conditions for fire to occur are a little bit more limited because that hot, dry period during the summer is much rarer than it is in the eastern part of the state or in the interior warm dry forests or in Southern California. Though, again, we'll talk about fire does occur here. We know that from several records in the past where, again, these areas have had fire being applied and used as a management tool since the time that people have been here and continuing through today. Fire is used to promote certain types of vegetation and intentionally lit, and that includes on the west side of the Cascades, not just in the drier interior ecosystems. And then there's also some work I'm showing here on the right-hand side, and these maps I'll get to in a second, but this is some work by Jerry Franklin and Miles Hemstrom a few years back here, where they reconstructed past fire events by going out and finding giant patches of trees that all seemed to have the same origination date, right? So if you find a giant patch of trees where it's like, wow, from here across this entire black patch that they drew here, everywhere in there, these trees all seem to have originated around the same time. It gives you a clue to that perhaps being some disturbance that sort of reset the stage there, and that's when those trees all established. And from that work, they came up with these past fire maps in Mount Rainier National Park that indicate that that's where we get a lot of the information about the fire return interval being around 450 years or so, because they could reconstruct those past patches there. So we have some information about fire being a part of the West Side Cascades for a very long time. But in 2020, there was, as part of this West Coast fire event, there was a very profound increase in the number of fires and the total area burned on the west side relative to what we had seen in the last couple of decades. And so this was really, 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 I think, surprising to a lot of folks in society, though there's lots of evidence in the scientific record that events like what happened in 2020 have happened in the past. But certainly from a societal standpoint, it led to this question of what do fires like what we saw in 2020, and I'll talk about those fires themselves shortly here. What does that mean for the Western Cascades? Because again, if you look at that map, it's easy to get lulled into a little bit of a false sense of security that fire doesn't play a role on the west side of the Cascades. Every year there's fires burning on the east side of the Cascades, and we usually get smoke from that over on the west side of the Cascades. But in terms of big fires, at least in most people's memory, there hasn't been many on the west side until 2020, and all of a sudden things broke loose. And so I'm going to share some insights throughout this talk from a paper that's in review right now in Ecosphere that several of us worked on and was led by Matt Riley, who's a Forest Service scientist at the Pacific Northwest Research Station, basically asking what do these fires mean for the Western Cascades. And so one very clear impact that they had is societally, these fires were extraordinarily challenging and catastrophic. Over a period of 48 hours in early September 2020, 723,000 acres burned in a period of 48 hours. And that was mostly in a few of these very large fires you can see in these hashed marks here: the Riverside Fire, the Beachy Creek Fire, the Holiday Farm Fire. 90,000 people were evacuated, and almost or more than 500,000 were placed on evacuation alert because these fires were burning very close to a lot of the high population density areas in Oregon, particularly the Portland metro area was very close to a lot of these fires, as well as Eugene and Salem and other cities in the Willamette Valley. The region had the worst air quality in the world for nearly 2 weeks. And that's something that we've seen even from smoke coming from elsewhere over the last few years, because the Willamette Valley and the Puget Trough tend to trap some of that air in when we get smoky air. And so that was a noticeable thing, even if you weren't immediately close to some of these fires. And then several billions of dollars of property and infrastructure was destroyed in these fires. So societally, these fires were a big wake-up call, and have elevated a lot of the research that we've been doing in this area, and in some ways kind of tweaked some of how we're asking some of these questions. And so most of what I'm going to share for the rest of the talk here is some of the work that we're doing in collaboration with these partners to understand 3 dimensions of these fires on the west side: the drivers of these fires, the characteristics of these fires, and the effects of them on the ecosystem response. And so let's walk through each of those one by one here. So one thing we're interested in asking is about the climate and weather drivers of these fires is, were these 2020 Labor Day fires unprecedented? So like I mentioned, 3/4 of a million acres burned in a 48-hour period, right? And you can see that on this figure right here from our paper, the cumulative acres burned in these fires that burned during that time period. These fires were not really doing much until all of a sudden these winds kicked up, and we'll get to that in a second, and just exploded these fires. And most of that area burned. More than 90% of it in these fires was burned in that 48-hour period. And one of the things we've been asking about in this paper is, how unprecedented is that occurrence? Because immediately following these fires, there was a lot of reactions of, this is all climate change that's causing this, or this is all forest management that's causing this. And one way to start addressing that is asking, are these things precedented in the past? And in fact, there are historical fires in this region that have operated pretty similarly. So it gives us an idea of this event, as catastrophic as it was from a societal standpoint, is actually not necessarily outside the bounds of what has historically happened in this ecosystem. And there's some documentary records of past fires. The Tillamook burned in 1933 that burned a similar amount of acreage in a short period of time. And then the Yakult complex, which this is just an astounding fact from that fire. This was in southern Washington, and I'll show you a map of this later on the talk. It spread 30 miles in 36 hours, right? So, traveling almost 1 mile per hour doesn't sound that fast when we're talking about a car or running. But when you're talking about a giant fire, that's a pretty rapid, sustained spread rate over that time period. And so a paper that Dan Donato, a collaborator of mine, led a few years back, actually, just by doing some of the math on like what kinds of fires must have had to be possible to sustain, or what kinds of fires must have had to have happened to make this fire regime possible on the west side of the Cascades, of this infrequent, high severity fire regime. And a lot of that mathematical work, it's kind of spatiotemporal mathematical work, suggests that fires like this are well within the natural fire regime in the Western Cascades, which is important to know, and also a little bit a very different challenge to work with than we think about those frequent fire dry forests elsewhere. And so a very different distinction of how fires work in this region. So what are some of the factors associated with those west side fires? Going back to those ingredients that I talked about in an earlier slide, we need dry late summer conditions. And this map on the left-hand side is showing the evaporative demand drought index, or EDI, which is one measure of drought. And this is the week prior to when those fires blew up. And particularly in Oregon here, where a lot of the bigger fires exploded that following week, we had drought indices that were in the upper 1 to 2 percentiles of historical record, right? So almost off the charts historical drought conditions in the late summer. At the same time, we had ignition sources, and that's almost a ubiquitous thing across most areas on the planet where there are humans, as well as, you know, lightning caused ignitions, right? Ignition sources are pretty abundant, and there were some ignition sources that had happened around that time. And then importantly, this synoptic east wind event. And what I mean by this is typically in this region, the prevailing winds are from the southwest to the northeast, right? We get all of those, all the moisture off the Pacific Ocean. We get a lot of our storms being delivered in that direction. And that's the prevailing wind in this region. Though very similar to what can happen in Southern California, and we often hear about as the Santa Ana winds or the Diablo winds in Northern California. We have this east wind dynamic in the Cascades where basically the winds get reversed and blow up and back over the Cascades and are through, you know, adiabatic warming as they're coming back down, are extremely warm and dry when they come back down. So it's very similar to the Santa Ana winds in Southern California. And when those occur and there's an ignition on the landscape and it's been dry, those ingredients really set the stage for very big fires to explode. And we know that that's been something that's been associated with some of those past fires, but also is something that unfolded before our eyes with these Labor Day fires last year. So, another part of our project, and this is just a really quick nod to some work in progress, is looking at what are the thresholds and the historical climatic conditions that are associated with wildfires like what we saw on Labor Day of 2020, as well as historical fires, and how might those conditions be changing in the future? Because if we can start to understand how not only the warm, dry conditions, but also the coincidence of those warm, dry conditions with those east winds that really fan those fires potentially might change in the future, that's going to be a really important piece of trying to understand how fire might change in this landscape. But you can imagine that's a really tricky thing to do in a region where there are so few data points to work with, right? And so if we look at, again, our Western Cascadia region, we've got some fires now to work with, but relative to other regions in the Western US, we have very few data points to work with, where you can parameterize fire climate models very strongly in areas where there's just been, you know, orders of magnitude more fire events in the last instrumental and satellite record. And so we're using the contemporary record to train our understanding of those mechanics, and then using regional climate models to try to project that into the future and understand how might these conditions that support West Side fires unfold in the future, and what does that mean for the region? Because it's a very different dynamic here than in many other more frequent fire ecosystems across the West. So another part, and this is probably the most, this is where I get to geek out the most on the geographic pieces of this. Another part we're looking at is the burn severity patterns and how these fires actually burn. And I'll tell you why that's particularly important here. And this is with a group of collaborators and graduate students here. Basically, we're asking, what are the characteristic spatial or landscape patterns of these wildfires on the West Side, and how are those driven by different factors? And when we think about a wildfire, it's really important to remember that although on every map I've shown so far, it's just the perimeter of those fires, and we might assume that everything within the perimeter of those fires is homogeneously burned in a certain way. Within those perimeters, there are actually extraordinarily intricate spatial patterns and landscape patterns of how that fire burned through, what the severity patterns were. And we've done some work on this in the Rockies, as well as lots of folks have done this in lots of different regions, looking at particularly burn severity, or how severely a forest was burned. And here's an example from the 1988 Yellowstone fires that just shows that was a huge fire event, but within that perimeter of that fire, there was a really, really, really complex mosaic of severely burned areas, unburned patches, more lightly burned strips here and there. And that template is really critical for setting the stage for what's left after the fire? What are the biological legacies that are left? What's the distance to live trees and seed sources, wildlife habitat, carbon storage, you name it. There's all sorts of different things that are going to be responding to that spatial pattern, and that heterogeneity in that system is really important for how the system is going to respond. Now, those historical fires on the west side, we do have some idea of what those patterns look like, but it's a very coarse and hazy view from some maps that suggest some of those fires were very big. So this is the Yakult burn, which burned, interestingly, the same exact week as the Labor Day fires did last year, and burned about a 500,000 acres or 200,000 hectares on the west side of the Cascades. And some landscape photographs of that really demonstrate how big some of those standard placing patches were. And so it's a challenge here because we've got some indication of some of those standard placing patches from those forest reconstructions. And this is an image of an old growth forest and then a past fire that burns part of that old growth forest. And we've got some of that on the landscape, but this landscape has been extraordinarily affected by logging and other management practices. And so a lot of those puzzle pieces are kind of missing from the landscape. Yet, and at the same time, our satellite record is pretty sparse here because we haven't had a lot of fires to work with. Until recently, now with the 2020 fires, we've got a good sample size to start unpacking how these fires burn in different severity patterns and what that means. So questions we're asking here, what are the characteristic spatial patterns of standard placing fire in Western Cascades? How do those patterns differ in fires that were driven by those east wind events or not? And how do these different patterns result from different drivers of topography, fuels, weather, things that we know from other systems are really important for driving burn severity patterns? And so we're taking some methods that we are applying from studies that we've done in the Rockies previously, looking at satellite burn severity maps, where we basically take a satellite index and convert it to where the fire was stand replacing, meaning it killed all of the above ground vegetation or not. Again, because that stand replacing area is where there's the hardest kind of reset of the forest. It needs to come back from seed following that. And then we're characterizing each fire and each patch of standard placing fire to look at how are those actually spatially configured across the landscape. So using satellite remote sensing, then with GIS and spatial landscape metrics to characterize how are these fires actually burning within that perimeter, and are they creating really big patches of high severity or not? Is that more complex? We're looking at all these different things. I'm just going to focus on one factor in the last part of the talk right now, in how these fires burn in some ways qualitatively differently between east wind driven fires and non-east wind driven fires. And I'll walk you through that in a second here. What we did is, for each of these fires, we looked at the burn progression map. And so this is one of these fires that started in this dark blue here and then burned out to the lighter green and yellow over different days. So this is how this fire progressed over time. And we can tell it's an east wind driven fire because it burned from east to west, and it interestingly burned downhill. Fires typically burn uphill, but when those east winds are kicking, similar to Santa Ana winds in Southern California, they can actually have fires burn very rapidly downhill, which is something that's typically only associated with those very strong wind events. So we're looking at how these patterns of burn severity potentially differ from fires that burned during non-east wind driven events. This is one that just burned during kind of more moderate conditions. The fire is essentially just burning from west to east and burning upslope following topography, ways that fire normally would. And so what are we finding? Lots of variability across the record of 33 fires. 7 of them were east wind driven, 26 were non-east wind driven, ranging in standard placing burn severity from 3% to 71%, and then fires from about 100 hectares to the largest being over 75,000 hectares in this record. And when we look at how those spatial patterns burn, we see some really interesting differences between the east wind driven versus the non-east wind driven fires. If a fire was not east wind driven, in these red dots here, there can be a wide range of standard placing severity, proportion of that fire that's standard placing. But once those east winds kick up, these fires really converge on about 50% of that burn severity mosaic is high severity or standard placing. And what that means is those east wind events have very strong scaling relationships with fire size, driving very large area weighted mean patch sizes, so very big patches of standard placing fire. Those patches are fairly simple in shape. They don't have very high edge to area ratios, and they result in a lot of very far from seed source, or what we call core area, in those patches. Essentially big standard placing patches that have lots of burned landscape that's far from a live tree that is required for seed source to come back in and repopulate these areas. If we break that down into what these individual patches across all these fires look like, 75% of these standard placing patches are 1 hectare or smaller in size, but they account for such a small proportion of the landscape relative to the 12 largest patches that burned in these fires, all from east wind driven fire events, account for over 80,000 hectares of standard placing burned area. In other words, these 12 patches that account for most of the total high severity burned area occurred during these east wind events over usually a matter of hours to days, and are going to have a very strong impact on this landscape. Okay, so what does this all mean for understanding the fire regime in Western Cascadia? First, fires come in 2 flavors. They really seem to be very different in terms of how they operate, whether if they're non-east wind driven events where they're fairly idiosyncratic in their standard placing burn severity patterns, versus when they're these east wind driven events, they are very consistently large and simple patches of standard placing fire, and that the extremes rule the landscape. So most of these patches that burned are really small, but a very small number of large patches that occurred, particularly in those Labor Day fire events from last year, have a profound effect on the landscape, and will for a very, very long time. I'm gonna, I realize we're short on time here, so I'm just gonna highlight a few things of some other work that's in the works, and then wrap things up here to make sure there's time for a few questions here. But Michelle Bonaducci is a PhD student in my lab, and she's looking at how these scaling patterns that I just showed for the West Side fires relate to other fire regimes across the West, and whether we can see how divergent or not these patterns are across different fire regimes that give us an idea of how differently the West Side fires are perhaps operating versus other fire regimes out there. So there are some of the questions that she's asking. And then really quickly, I'm just going to highlight a lot of our work currently is out there in the field characterizing the post-fire forest response. And we know that old growth forests on the West Side, if you look around, you can find evidence of them being born of fire, but typically fires, here on the left-hand side, we're looking at old growth forest that's 600 years old that originated following a big standard placing fire 600 years ago. And we know that the forests were resilient from that fire because they're here today in this majestic old growth form. But how will these forests bounce back from today's fires that are in a very different context here? And so a lot of our work, just for time's sake, I'm gonna zoom through this, is tackling several of these questions of what are the drivers of how trees are responding, the post-fire tree regeneration, how are how are these fires setting up the early sterile plant communities in ways that we haven't had a chance to really unpack and understand? And what are the consequences of these fires for carbon dynamics and potential future fires in these locations? So for this, we have a network of plots across the region where we're studying this. And very, very, very quickly, I'll just highlight all the tremendous amount of field work that goes into collecting all of these data, and the over 25 field technicians that we've had, primarily undergraduate students who get paid to do this work. And then again, we're looking at how are the forests responding to the fires via tree regeneration, and that's something that Madison Laughlin, a graduate student in my lab, is currently looking at. How are the early sterile plant communities that are almost impossible to measure retrospectively, but really need real-time measurements to characterize? How are those coming back? And that's something that Liliana Rangel-Para is looking at for her master's work. And then finally, or as a part of that, what are some of the culturally important plants that are coming back? Again, we know that these are cultural landscapes that have been managed for a very long time using fire to promote things like huckleberry. And so we're looking at how huckleberry is coming back over different conditions following fire. And then finally, looking at this reburn potential in these areas. After a fire comes through, it changes the carbon dynamics, also changes the fuel dynamics. And so Jenna Morris is a PhD student in my lab looking at how these forests are affected by fire in terms of what it means for carbon dynamics, as well as the potential for them to reburn. So this is a really interesting and kind of humbling study to work on, because it really is kind of a relay race of studies that are going to be needed to track this over time. These systems are characterized by dynamics that unfold over centuries, and we're really just in the first few years following fire in this infrequent and high severity fire regime here. And so what we're seeing right now, those late summer drought and synoptic east winds are really important drivers of these west side fires, and perhaps particularly so because that's a different dynamic than what drives fire activity in other systems elsewhere. The spatial patterns of fires on the west side of the Cascades are really different between these east wind driven or non-east wind driven fires. And so these infrequent but east wind driven fires are really important for shaping the landscape. And I didn't really get a chance to talk through much of the detail because I had to wrap things up here, but happy to answer questions on this last part. But basically what we're finding is what the forest looked like prior to the fire is a big, big, big driver of what comes back following the fire. If it was an old growth forest, you have a very different post-fire response than if it was a younger forest that had been recently disturbed or logged and replanted and then burned. Okay, apologize for having to rush through the last parts there, but that is it. And I'm happy to take any questions and or follow up offline with questions from anybody. So thanks for listening and tuning in, and happy to answer any questions if there's time.
Thanks, Brian, for really, really interesting. There's so many dimensions to this. I want to just invite people. First of all, we have like on the clock, we have like 3 minutes until 1. But if you're willing to stick around for a few minutes, and if people who want to ask questions want to, then we can extend it a few minutes. We don't always go right by 1 o'clock. Do you have to run right at 1, or do you have a few extra minutes if we need them?
I've got a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to ask people if they have questions, post those in the chat, and we'll invite you to unmute and ask your question. I know some people will have to leave because they have other obligations, but this is a good time. Post a question if you have one, and ask Dr. Harvey your question. So it always takes about a minute or so before anything shows up in the chat. I'll kind of fill in while we're waiting. Oh, well, here's one right now. Here's Earl Ellis. Earl, go ahead.
Yeah, it was great to see that. Nice and very interesting talk. And it was great to see that you were linking in indigenous cultural burning as part of the actual system that shapes the fire and shapes the vegetation. And so what I'm curious about is, this study or the practices of these studies very much look like pure ecology to me. For example, you're describing the forest as, say, an old growth forest, whereas that's probably a very artificial creation of forcing indigenous people off the landscape and suppressing fires in these regions. And I'm just curious, is there kind of a future plan or effort to restore indigenous peoples and their cultural burning practices to these landscapes?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's a really important thing to highlight in these landscapes because oftentimes the role that humans have played and indigenous burning has played in forests is more incorporated into the general fire ecology in frequent fire forest ecosystems and less so in infrequent fire ecosystems like the west side of the Cascades. Though, as you bring up, it's a really obviously that shaping of these being cultural landscapes is just as important here. It's just it's kind of a different flavor of what that looks like in an infrequent fire system like this. And I would say, there are definitely lots of projects and collaborations going on right now with bringing back and re-engaging with fire in these landscapes through the lens of an inclusion of indigenous practices. In a lot of areas, some of that has started prior to these 2020 fires and has been going on with areas where, for example, huckleberry patches that had been maintained as huckleberry patches through the use of fire up on ridges are sites where those practices are, being expanded right now. But also in these areas that have burned, one way to think about this is, these fires happened and it's not just that we're all sort of passive observers of how the system is going to be responding, right? We have a choice on these landscapes and we have a choice of how we want to manage these landscapes. And so in one of our project with the Tulalip tribes is understanding how these fires are potentially setting now a post-fire template of areas where the fire might have kicked back the system to where some of those culturally important plants are going to be more abundant post-fire in certain locations than in other locations. And can those locations kind of be used as anchor points to continue the promotion of those plants through the use of fire versus other areas that might be more prioritized for reforestation and timber harvesting, right? There's kind of like one way we think about in a lot of these forests is the early sterile post-fire conditions that are often actually one of the rarest habitat types on the west side of the Cascades, even more rare than old growth forests. Fire is the big disturbance that creates those. And so how can we use these landscapes in ways that anchors management around harnessing that early sterile condition that was very much part of how fire was used historically and continue today through a lot of the tribes in the area. Those areas are extremely biodiverse and have a lot of culturally important plants rather than rushing to get trees back on those landscapes and have those early sterile conditions sustained for a little bit longer.
Thanks. We do have one more question from Chris Hahn. Chris, want to unmute and ask the question?
Sure. Hi, Brian. Thanks for your talk. I want to know more about your research on the responses of old growth forests versus the secondary forests that you had.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for thanks for asking that question. I knew as I was rushing through it, I was like, well, maybe someone will ask about this because I didn't leave myself much time to talk about it. So thank you for asking. Yeah, I can let me I'll go to this figure, and this is part of Liliana's master's thesis. And any of these, I think, would be a good place to talk about this dimension of it. But this is a particularly interesting one because when we look at biodiversity, and that could be plant or animal diversity in these forests, there typically is a U-shaped relationship in the absence of fire over time, right? So like following a fire and then a long period of time after that fire, there's a big peak of biodiversity in the early post-fire conditions because there's been all this, all of these conditions that are, all of these resources that are now available, all this space and opportunity that's available, right? And then in the mid-sterile stage, basically that's when it's tree dominated, but almost to the exclusion of anything else in these ecosystems. And so we often see that big dip in biodiversity in the mid-sterile stages. And then in old growth forests, where the trees start to die and it's more kind of like gap dynamics that start opening up, there's an increase in diversity, plant diversity and animal diversity, because there's more opportunities, more conditions that are opened back up. And so, yeah, I saw the question pop up here. Sterile is just, yeah, it's a term for where you are in the SEER, or time between disturbances. So you can think about this as early sterile, early post-fire, mid-sterile, mid-post-fire, and late sterile, old growth, long time since fire. Yeah, sorry for the not explaining those. Okay, so what I just set up is like, you know, this U-shaped relationship here is something that we see in the absence of fire. If you were to just go out and measure old growth stands, middle age stands, and young stands that haven't been dominated by trees yet, you'd find this relationship in biodiversity. What's interesting is what we're seeing is the post-fire biodiversity has that same response to it. And one thing we're thinking about is that these areas have a lot more ingredients for that post-fire diversity already there when the fire occurs, versus these ones in the middle age, they're dominated by trees. And so a lot of the ingredients for it, particularly the herbaceous and shrubby component of plant diversity, isn't really there pre-fire. And when those areas burn, it's not coming back as diverse. And so it's this, I feel like this is one of those response variables that I zipped through at the end there that really demonstrates how important that stand age or stand stage is at the time when that fire comes through. And it's interesting how it does sort of follow this U-shaped distribution that would be similar to what you'd find pre-fire in these ecosystems. Does that help answer that question?
Yeah, I was also wondering about, it seems like, you know, the disturbance that you're talking about is specifically fire with this. And I was wondering if like timber harvesting was also something that was present within this area that would also have some responses like this.
Absolutely. Yes. And in fact, when we're looking at this graph in any of our plots, the mid-sterile, actually, hang on, let me zoom back to a slide that I had to zoom over. Okay, this is a good landscape shot that looks across at what this mosaic of stand ages looks like prior to fire. So this is one of our burn sites. This is an area that didn't burn in that, right? The late sterile or old growth forest, this is, you know, classic kind of like 600, 700-year-old trees, very complex forest structure, all of that comes with old growth forests, and was fire originated from a fire 600 years ago in this location. The mid-Sterile are fire origin from fires that in the 1890s that were standard placing fires that came through these areas. The early Sterile, almost exclusively in all the areas we've been sampling, are actually post-harvest landscapes, right? Because this is a very, this is a landscape that's been, again, like strongly impacted by timber harvesting over the last century or close to century. And so what's interesting is these early Sterile conditions are not necessarily fire originated early Sterile when the fire that we're looking at burns them. They're actually past clear cut and replant was the most recent disturbance. And in some ways, what's interesting about that is if we go back to this slide, if those areas, even though they've had this, very strong, profound anthropogenic disturbance as the most recent disturbance, they actually could be really important anchor points for bringing back some of the culturally and ecologically important dimensions to these landscapes, because they're missing some components of a early Sterile post-fire condition, because they're not going to have like large coarse woody debris and big logs and snags and things like that that are important for habitat, because those things all got logged off. But if they were disturbed through logging and that catalyzed some potential response in the herbaceous and shrubby understory, even though they were replanted with trees, maybe that set a condition that preconditions them for this recent fire to actually respond with that high diversity again. And so it's exciting. That's true for overall diversity, and it's also true. I zoomed through this one, but for huckleberry, which is one of the culturally important plants, huckleberry is actually seemingly highest in those areas that were logged, replanted, and then burned versus some of the older forests. And it may just be, it may be a situation where, even though that was a different disturbance, it's like, these are disturbance adapted systems, and those two disturbances combined are promoting a response that is more lagged than the other ones because there's been a longer time since disturbance. Does that help answer that question? It's a really good question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been really, really interesting, and we could go on all day, except we can't go on all day, unfortunately. So we're at 1:10. I think we're going to have to close out at this point, but we do have Dr. Harvey's email address right in the flyer that we sent out, and anybody who wants to follow up and ask questions can contact him at that address. So Brian, thanks a lot for really, really interesting seminar. Things are really complicated out there, but in fascinating ways. So we really appreciate your joining us. I'm going to stop the recording now and let everybody know that the recording will be posted on the YouTube channel of the Center for Social Science Scholarship probably within a few days. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and the great questions. And yeah, please follow up with any questions via email. I'm happy to keep the conversation going.
Okay, we will invite people to do that. I'm going to turn the recording off now.